Hey gamers, welcome back to Epic Encounters. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic gaming disasters in recent memory, Concord. If you've been following the train wreck, you'll know this is our second video on the subject, and honestly, I hope it's the last. But with new drama emerging every day, Concord just can't seem to stay out of the spotlight, and it's all for the wrong reasons. From dismal player numbers to shockingly toxic developer behavior, and even the removal of the LGBTQ+ tag from Steam. This game is becoming a textbook example of how to alienate your audience. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, we've got even more eye-opening details to share. Buckle up, because we're about to dissect everything that went wrong with Concord.
We laid out the plan, and it's been a matter of working really hard to deliver on that plan for many, many years. And I think it has been, but we've stayed core to what we set out to do. Concord looks like the Concord we hope, with room to grow into we had big ideas that obviously we had to build a strong foundation first, and that's what we've done, and we hope to continue building. But that strong foundation is Concord. It's what Concord has been.
Mm-hmm.
Concord was supposed to be a major release, a blockbuster AAA title from Sony, with all the bells and whistles that come with a high-budget game. Instead, it's turned into one of the biggest flops the gaming world has seen in years. According to SteamDB, Concord reached a peak concurrent player count of just 697. Yes, you heard that right. 697 players at its peak. To put that into perspective, the game's open beta in July hit a peak of 2,388 players, which means the game saw a staggering 71% decline in player numbers at launch. Even the early access beta did better, with a peak of 1,124 players, marking a 38% drop from early access to full launch. For a game with the backing of a major publisher like Sony, these numbers are nothing short of catastrophic. So, what caused this massive decline? The answer lies in Concord's misguided focus on pushing a woke DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, agenda, rather than delivering quality gameplay. The game is filled with characters that seem to exist solely to check boxes on a progressive checklist. Fat, unattractive women are portrayed as powerful and desirable. LGBTQ+ and non-binary characters are front and center, and the narrative takes every opportunity to mock traditional values. The gameplay itself feels like an afterthought, resulting in clunky controls, repetitive combat, and uninspired level design. Gamers saw through this facade and have rejected Concord outright. But it's not just about the character design or the gameplay. The overall atmosphere of the game feels forced and unnatural. The developers seem to have prioritized sending a message over creating an engaging experience, and when gamers feel like they're being preached to rather than entertained, they check out. The result is exactly what we're seeing with Concord: a massive drop in player engagement, widespread criticism, and a game that's likely to be forgotten in a matter of months. One of the biggest mistakes that Concord made was assuming that gamers would automatically embrace its woke agenda just because it's trendy or politically correct. But the reality is that gamers are more discerning than that. They want games that are fun to play, with well-developed characters, engaging stories, and immersive worlds. When a game prioritizes ideology over these core elements, it's destined to fail. And that's exactly what happened with Concord. But the problems with Concord go far beyond just its design and gameplay. The behavior of the developers in response to the game's failure has been nothing short of shocking. You know when you hire a bad employee, you're going to get a bad result, especially if that person is leading the charge for whatever your effort is. And when it comes to Concord, from Firewalk Studios, that seems to be exactly what happened. A former Concord developer, who now claims to work for PUBG Studios, recently took to social media to express his pride in the game, calling it a labor of love. But when faced with the reality of the game's poor performance, his attitude quickly turned sour. In response to a sympathetic comment that acknowledged the game's struggles, this developer lashed out, calling critics talentless freaks and claiming he didn't care about the negative feedback. This kind of response is not only unprofessional, it's toxic. It's clear why Concord is the disaster it is when you consider the people behind it. And here's the big question. Why did PUBG Studios hire such a toxic developer? What does it say about the culture in these studios when developers feel comfortable lashing out at critics in such a nasty way? It's a concerning sign of the times when professionals in the industry think it's acceptable to belittle and insult their audience instead of taking constructive criticism to heart. But this developer wasn't done. Despite claiming not to care about the criticism, he went on to hide several critical responses to his post and even demanded $8 from users if they wanted to see the hidden replies. It's a level of arrogance and pettiness that's hard to comprehend. Rather than engage with the community and understand where they went wrong, the developer chose to dismiss all criticism as coming from talentless freaks. This behavior is emblematic of a much larger issue in the industry. When developers start to see themselves as infallible, they lose the ability to connect with their audience, and the games they produce suffer as a result. And it doesn't stop with just one developer. The game's lead character designer, John Wisniewski, has a history of making inflammatory statements on social media. Back in 2020, Wisniewski claimed that the justice system in the United States is based on white supremacy, and his extreme views clearly influenced the game's design. Concord isn't just a game, it's a vehicle for pushing a specific political agenda, and gamers have responded by rejecting it outright. But wait, it gets worse. According to reports, another developer from Concord demanded to be called Professor by her colleagues, pushing extreme politics and creating a toxic work environment. This developer, Lisa Brown, who came out as non-binary, reportedly forced everyone at the company to address her as Professor and regularly held meetings titled with phrases like "teaching learning with the professor." She was said to have extreme views, including a hatred of guns, and allegedly pushed for the firing of staff who didn't align with her politics. This kind of behavior is a clear example of what happens when you hire activists instead of professionals. It creates an environment where delusion, narcissism, and authoritarianism are allowed to run rampant. The fact that this was happening at a game studio is concerning, but it's also a symptom of a much larger problem in the industry. When developers are more concerned with enforcing their personal beliefs than with creating a quality product, it's no wonder the game flopped. And if you thought things couldn't get any worse, let's talk about the reaction from gaming media. According to a community lead at IGN, if you don't like Concord, you're a bad human being. That's right. IGN, always at its finest with their woke journalists, is essentially telling gamers that their preferences and opinions make them morally inferior. It's so funny to watch all this woke salt flow like a river, especially when the game they're defending is such a disaster. But it also speaks to a larger issue within gaming media, the refusal to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the game's failure has something to do with its focus on pushing an agenda rather than creating a good game. This kind of attitude from IGN isn't new, but it's still frustrating. Rather than engage in meaningful discussion about why Concord failed, they'd rather shame their audience for not buying into the game's agenda. It's a tactic that's becoming all too common in the media. Ignore the legitimate criticisms and instead attack the critics. But gamers are smarter than that, and they're not falling for it. The backlash against Concord is proof that the gaming community isn't interested in being lectured to by self-righteous journalists. As if things couldn't get any worse for Concord, the developers reportedly removed the LGBTQ+ tag from Steam after seeing how poorly the game was performing. This is the same game that was heavily marketed as inclusive and progressive, a game that was supposed to set a new standard for diversity in gaming. But now, it seems the developers are trying to quietly distance themselves from the very thing they were promoting. But here's the kicker. Removing the LGBTQ+ tag is only going to make things worse for Concord. Not only have they alienated a large portion of their potential player base, but now they're likely to anger the LGBTQ+ community as well. It's as if the developers are shooting themselves in the foot over and over again. They built their entire marketing campaign around being inclusive, and now they're trying to backtrack because they see it's not working. But it's too late. The damage is done, and the game is doomed to fail. What's truly ironic is that this decision to remove the LGBTQ+ tag is likely to backfire in spectacular fashion. The community that they were so eager to court is now going to see this as a betrayal, and the gamers who rejected the game from the start aren't going to be swayed by such a transparent attempt at damage control. The developers of Concord seem to be in a no-win situation, largely of their own making. It's almost as if they're throwing darts in the dark, hoping to hit something that will save the game, but in reality, they're just making things worse. One of the most interesting and disturbing things that many of my viewers have commented on is the possibility that woke games like Concord are being financed by government tax money to promote a specific agenda. If this is true, it's an absolute disaster. Tax money belongs to the people, and it should be used for the public good, not to fund propaganda that alienates and insults large portions of the population. Let's think about this for a moment. If Concord and games like it are being funded by tax dollars, that means your hard-earned money is being used to push an agenda that many people don't agree with. It's not just about creating a game with diverse characters or progressive themes. Those things can be great when done right. It's about using public funds to push a very specific, very divisive narrative, and that's something that should concern everyone, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum. If this is true, it raises serious questions about the priorities of those in charge. Why are they using taxpayer money to push a divisive agenda rather than creating games that everyone can enjoy? Why are they prioritizing politics over quality and fun? These are questions that need to be answered, and if Concord was indeed financed with public funds, it's a scandal that should not be ignored. It's an issue that goes beyond just this one game. It speaks to a larger problem in how public funds are being allocated and the lack of accountability in how they're being used. What's even funnier, or more infuriating, depending on how you look at it, is how silent many gaming news outlets have been about Concord's flop. It's almost as if they're deliberately ignoring the failure, hoping that if they don't talk about it, people will forget. But the truth is out there, and gamers know what's going on. Some outlets that have mentioned Concord's failure are actually suggesting that the developers might save the game by making it free to play. They argue that there's nothing wrong with all the LGBTQ+ and pronoun nonsense, and that the only issue is the price tag. But let's be real. Making the game free to play isn't going to solve the problem. The issue isn't just the cost, it's the entire premise of the game. As one of my commenters pointed out, the only way to save Concord would be to completely remake the game without all the woke BS. Only then, maybe, they could attract a decent player base. But even then, it might be too late. The damage to Concord's reputation has already been done. No amount of rebranding or price adjustments is going to change that perception. The game's issues run too deep, and unless the developers are willing to take a hard look at what went wrong and make significant changes, there's little hope for Concord to recover. It's also worth noting that the media's silence on this issue is telling. When a game fails this spectacularly, you'd expect the gaming press to cover it extensively, to analyze what went wrong, and to discuss the implications for the industry. But that hasn't happened. Instead, many outlets seem to be downplaying the failure or ignoring it altogether. It's almost as if they're afraid to criticize a game that aligns with their own ideological views. But gamers see through this, and the lack of honest reporting only serves to further erode trust in the gaming media. So where does this leave Concord? It's clear that the game is a failure, but it's also a valuable lesson for the gaming industry. Prioritizing a political agenda over quality gameplay is a recipe for disaster. Gamers don't want to be preached to. They want to be entertained. And when a game fails to deliver on that front, it doesn't matter how progressive it is. No one is going to want to play it. Concord could have been a great game. It had the backing of a major publisher, a decent budget, and all the resources needed to create something truly special. But instead of focusing on what really matters, gameplay, story, and characters, the developers chose to push a divisive and polarizing agenda. And the result is a game that's been rejected by the very community it was supposed to appeal to. It's a shame, because the gaming industry is full of talented developers who could create amazing games if they weren't so bogged down by the need to be politically correct. But as long as studios prioritize ideology over creativity, we're going to keep seeing more flops like Concord. It's a wake-up call for the industry, and one that hopefully won't be ignored. In conclusion, Concord is a perfect example of what happens when developers prioritize an agenda over gameplay. It's a game that could have been great, but instead it's been rejected by the very community it was supposed to appeal to. The player numbers are dismal, the feedback is overwhelmingly negative, and no amount of backtracking by the developers is going to change that. The funniest thing is that many gaming news outlets are either silent about this flop, or they're suggesting that making the game free-to-play might save it. But as we've discussed, the problem with Concord runs much deeper than just the price tag. What do you think about Concord's failure? Do you think the developers are out of touch with what gamers want? Do you believe that games like this could be financed by government tax money? And do you think making the game free-to-play would actually make a difference? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this one. And with that, we wrap up this deep dive into Concord. If you enjoyed this video, or if you're as shocked by Concord's failure as I am, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth gaming analysis. As always, keep exploring, keep gaming, and stay epic.
We laid out the plan, and it's been a matter of working really hard to deliver on that plan for many, many years. And I think it has been, but we've stayed core to what we